And we're back. Episode 5 of the Melbourne Jail, Australia. Just had some coffee, feeling good. I hope you're enjoying this, because I am. Learning should be enjoyable. That's how we absorb knowledge. That's how we retain knowledge. We study things that interest us. And we left off here with the scaffold, and we're dissecting this exhibit, because it has a title, The Scaffold, but it has some text. And what we did last time is we recognized that as visitors, we immediately focus our attention on the Big Bang. This thing here. Forget all the words and all these sentences. I want to see how this contraption works. And you push the button, and so now you're participating in the exhibit. You are immersed in the prison experience. You're enjoying this. You're with your friends, your family. You're kind of chuckling along the way, saying, I'm going to press this button and watch that body drop through the floor. And then your friend says, yeah, but there's Mick Jagger over here. And you say, what? Mick Jagger? Of the Rolling Stones? And then you absorb that and so on and so forth. So now you've looked at the most obvious features of this exhibit, and now you're going to pause and you say, I want to know more about what the scaffold represents. There might be some historical material. The scaffold is a killing contrivance of the roughest and most inhuman kind, and its design is not unlike the trapping of birds in a snowy weather in the mother country a century ago. Now that's very poetic, folks. That's from the early Chronicles of Melbourne, 1888. Gary Owen, also known as Edmund Finn. The current scaffold inside the Melbourne jail is more solid, sophisticated structure than one described above by Gary Owen. Based on the standard 19th century British design, it was installed in 1865 and remains in use until capital punishment was abolished in Victoria in 1975, which is not ancient history. Up until 1975, the death penalty was still part of the legal apparatus in the great state of Victoria. There's more text, so now we're in a different mode. We're actually being a little bit more studious, rather than having a chuckle with the scaffold and pressing the button and so on and so forth, or once again marveling at the fact that Mick Jagger winds up in the Melbourne jail. The first scaffold used on this site was built for the hanging of two aboriginals, as we oftentimes say, Bob and Jack, in 1842. It was poorly made, failed to work properly, and fell to pieces. At this time, the jail had no walls, and the hangings took place in the open, a full view of the public. That's the public spectacle. These prefabricated scaffolds were costly and inefficient. In the 1850s, a semi-permanent scaffold was erected in the jail courtyard behind the newly built surrounding walls. However, it was still possible to view hangings from nearby, the high ground. John Wilkes, a visitor to the jail in 1863, described yet another scaffold enclosed in a sort of high shed in one of the yards. It was a solemn feeling to stand under the drop from which so many human beings have been precipitated into eternity. Now that's also poetic. I never would have put those words together. Precipitated into eternity. John Wilkes. Thanks for adding that literary spin. The August newspaper, 1865, reported a new drop had been constructed, consisting of a platform, a trapdoor, a fixed beam from which the rope was suspended. Between 1865 and 1924, 51 people were hanged in the jail on the scaffold. In 1932, the scaffold was dismantled and re-erected at Pentridge, prison in Coburg, also in Victoria. Most of the work was carried out by the Pentridge prisoner David Bennett, a carpenter by trade. Convicted of rape, Bennett was hanged once the scaffold was in place. A further 10 people were hanged on the same scaffold in Pentridge. So you had this prisoner carrying out the craftsmanship of this device that would then consume him, or as Wilkes would say, precipitated into eternity. So it makes you wonder, did David Bennett really know that he was actually constructing a device that would take his own life? I don't know. And that's part of the prison experience. There's a lot of open-ended messaging going on. They give us this capsule of material, but you might then say, I'm really interested in this David Bennett thing. So people then go home and they go on the internet and they continue the prison museum experience. It's something that they don't leave at the doorstep of the prison museum. They bring it home. They tell their friends. They go to the pub. They have a pint with their friends. Let me rephrase it. In Australia, they don't drink pints. They drink schooners. Okay, so they go to the pub and they have a schooner with their mates, and they talk about this bloke, David Bennett, who constructed this scaffold that he was then executed. So the storytelling institution continues. This is what we do as part of the prison museum experience. All right, back to the text. A fully functioning replica of the 1860 scaffold was installed in the Melbourne jail for the Ned Kelly film, 1969. And there's actually a couple of versions of this film, but this is the 1960 version with Mick Jagger of the Rolling Stones. The original scaffold was returned to Pentridge during the 1970s, stored at the old Melbourne jail, and reinstalled here in 2000. Okay, and there we have Mick Jagger. And I'm foreshadowing. I'm not going to say anything more about this story of Ned Kelly at this time. Oops. There we are. Got so caught up in the storytelling, I lost track. All right, back to the gallery. Bob and Jack, the Aboriginals. And here we have a shift of tone. We have stepped away from Mick Jagger and all of these seemingly amusing features of the Melbourne jail. And this is very common in museum studies, is to kind of put the amusing stuff over on one side of the gallery, and then as visitors make their way into another zone, there is a shift in emotional register. Things become a little more solemn. That's very important in museum studies. It's very important as a curator to kind of give the amusing stuff to the visitors at one stage of the tour, but then back off and get visitors to realize what we're dealing with is really serious subject matter, especially with executions of Aboriginal people in Australia. Extremely solemn. Cultural sensitivity becomes an imperative at this stage of the tour. And then here we read. Early European settlers in isolated districts lived in constant fear of the Aboriginal uprising when 5 Aboriginals shot 2 whalers in Cape Patterson in 1841. An example was made of them. The 2 men, they just call them Bob and Jack, and 3 women, one of whom was Truganini, storytelling institution. The story of Truganini, I mentioned in other episodes in Australia, Robert Hughes and The Fatal Shore, and he writes at length about Truganini. I'm not going to delve into that at this point. I want to keep moving. They had come from Tasmania, 1839, George Robinson, chief protector of the Aboriginals. So this is a colonial society that is controlling the indigenous people, the Aboriginal people. They claim that Truganini recognized one of the whalers, Yankee, as the man who some years ago had abducted her and murdered her husband. They killed him as payback. At their trial in the Melbourne jail, Judge Willis sent women to Flinders Island, but told the 2 men, the punishment that awaits you is not one of vengeance, but of terror. Transgressions. They were hanged publicly in the site, the Melbourne jail, 1842. Several thousand turned out to watch. One observer called it an appalling, disgusting scene. The execution was bungled. The drop didn't open properly under Jack, and John Davies, the colony's first executioner, took him back to the scaffold while repairs were carried out. Bob and Jack died slowly, writhing convulsively, while local Aboriginals looked on from a distance. The Aboriginal people and the Europeans who showed up to transform Australia in their vision. And these are the legacies. And here the shift of tone becomes a little bit more pedagogical. The art of hanging. Hanging is a fine art, not a mechanical trade. It is not a man or an artist who can painlessly, without brutality, dispatch another man. Charles Duff wrote in this 1928 book, The Handbook of Hanging. He described how successful hanging techniques were developed in the 19th century for the method of execution known as the long drop. Now, let me summarize. The long drop, this was the art of hanging. And that is, if the rope is too short, the prisoner would strangle to death. The spinal cord would remain intact and they would be strangled to death. If it is too long, it has a whipping effect, and that is the head might very well be decapitated. So it's like a snapping, whipping effect, and the head pops off like a Pez dispenser, I guess. And these are the things they were struggling with. The length of the rope, as we mentioned here, and here we have the case of Emma Williams, 5'2", 65 kilos, hanged at the Melbourne jail. Her neck was badly torn. The drop was a little too much for the weight. And there you go. List of executions. Let's pause.